All right. Good morning to all, or at least for a few more minutes. My name is Lauren Snyder, and I am a member of the Bloomington Rotary Club and an immediate past president. I do want to recognize our current club president, Mr. Aaron Davis. Where is Aaron Davis? He's in the room somewhere. Back over there. Thank you, Aaron, for your service and your leadership of the club for this year. I know what you're going through as an immediate past president. Thank you all for being here at our annual Business Outlook panel presented by the Bloomington Chamber of Commerce and the Bloomington Rotary Clubs. And I hope you are looking forward to hearing more about the state of the economy on the global, national, state, and local level from some leading economic experts from our very own IU Kelley School of Business. Now I do want to invite up our Bloomington Rotary Treasurer, Kyla Cox-Deckard, to lead us with the pledge and reflection. Kyla, and please rise for the pledge.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. Good morning, fellow Rotarians, Chamber of Commerce members, and guests. It is a tradition of Bloomington Rotary Club to start our meetings with a reflection offered by a Rotarian, typically on the topic of some recent insights, news, thoughts on Rotary efforts, and important community topics. For several years, the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Clubs of Bloomington, along with the Kelley School of Business, have partnered on this Business Outlook and Economic Forecast event. It makes sense because each organization has a deep connection to business. Rotary is rooted in the concept that business and professional people brought together as a network can accomplish amazing feats of service to their communities and to the world. The Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce unites local business for better business and better community. And the Kelley School of Business educates our rising business professionals, current executives, and leaders across the state and the nation that take us from moment to momentum. We can all likely agree that the health of our economy is important, and understanding how to prepare for the twists and the turns of future are critical to a strong community and state. Our club president, Aaron Davis, recently led a presentation for our club on Rotary International's peace-building work. When we think of a need for peace, I know that I often, and many of you may, draw upon images of war-torn countries, a lack of water sanitation that threatens the lives of children and adults, and dangerous governmental unrest that results in a surge of refugees seeking protection and basic necessities. And certainly these issues demand our attention. Other critical issues threatening peace include poverty, domestic violence, mass incarceration, a lack of education access, and these all affect many Hoosiers in our state. The concept of positive peace, ensuring justice for all, focuses on elements that a community, a state, and a nation need to address so that they can create peace. On the list of 8 factors Rotary International has identified as critical to positive peace, a strong business environment is key. And countries that improve positive peace also outperform comparable countries in GDP growth, according to the Institute for Economics and Peace. The United States ranks 128th out of 163 countries on the Peace Index. Among the 50 states, Indiana's Peace Index ranks 23rd. Our organizations, the many represented here by all of you, and those across our community, region, and state, have a role in peace through a thriving economy that reduces poverty and promotes a greater quality of life. Let's strive to continue our partnership for the prosperity of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla, for that reflection and insightful words. Thank you. Many of you in attendance and in the audience are, in fact, Rotarians. no Rotarians or are aware of the impactful work in our community, Rotary is a global-based organization with 1.2 million volunteers positively impacting our community, state, nation, and world. More simply put, the Rotary motto of service above self. Globally, Rotary is currently committed to finishing the fight of eradicating polio from our world, something many of us in the United States haven't worried about in many years or even decades, and providing access to clean water to all citizens of the world. Every few moments of time, a child dies due to not having access to clean water. These are initiatives of Rotary International. Locally, the Bloomington Rotary Clubs, there are 3 of them, have given back hundreds of thousands of dollars and service hours to our organizations in the community, like the Boys and Girls Club, Wonder Lab, Teachers Warehouse, and brand new in 2019, It Takes a Village, focusing on child and maternal health within our communities, to name a few of what the good works of Rotarians in our Bloomington community. I'm a proud 3rd-generation Rotarian. Both of my grandfathers and my father were Rotarians, and if any of you have any interest in being part of something bigger, locally or globally, I invite you to talk with a Rotarian and or visit one of our 3 clubs right here in town. Now I want to introduce our proud partner from the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, Miss Erin Predmore. Erin, come on up.
Thank you all for joining us here today. As I look out at all of your smiling faces, I see many friends of the Chamber and also friends of Rotarians, as I've gotten to visit some of your clubs myself. The Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce is proud to continue partnering with the Bloomington Rotary to host the 2019 Business Outlook Luncheon. This event has been held annually for many years and always provides excellent insight and information. We're glad to have our panelists here with us today and look forward to a great conversation with them. We have a wonderful turnout, and I'm sure our panelists will have a variety of comments about how things have changed in this past year, including adding to that their 2020 forecast. On your tables and in your programs, you will find a number of local businesses that help sponsor today's event. We greatly appreciate their support, and please join me in a round of applause to thank our sponsors. And as a bit of housekeeping, I also want to make sure you get your parking pass validated. If you need validation, if it didn't happen for you on the way in, please be sure to stop by the registration area on your way out, and someone there will stamp your parking pass for you after the program. We also want to thank the Kelley School of Business for their support in today's Business Outlook Luncheon, which clearly would not be possible without them. Before I welcome our moderator to the stage, I would like to invite you to 2 of our upcoming Chamber events. This Thursday, November 7th, we will be hosting a ribbon cutting for ourselves. Our new office is located at 421 West 6th Street, right at the corner of Rogers and 6th, and we'd love to invite all of our community members to join us at 9:30 a.m. for the ribbon cutting, or to stop by any time between 9 and noon on Thursday for an office tour and some refreshments. Next Friday, November 15th, the Chamber will host Senator Mike Braun at Ivy Tech for our Federal Focus Luncheon. Senator Braun will be updating us on federal issues that impact our local community and answering questions from the audience as well. Details and registration information for both of these events are located on our website, which is www.chamberbloomington.org. At this time, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Laureen Mays, to the podium. Laureen is the Executive Associate Dean of Faculty and Research at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. Please give Laureen a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's my pleasure to be here today representing the Kelley School of Business. I want to talk a little bit about the Indiana Business Research Center, who is responsible for the panel today. The Indiana Business Research Center, or IBRC, as we call it at the Kelley School, was established in 1925 and is an integral part of the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. It provides and interprets economic information needed by the state's businesses, governments, and organizations, as well as users nationwide and actually internationally. Now we've provided some information, I believe, for a group in Australia. The IBRC maintains databases on numerous topics such as income, employment, taxes, sectors of the economy, education, and demographics, just to mention a few. In addition, the center conducts original research. We have a number of researchers at the center to generate needed information when existing data is not available or sufficient. So our goal basically in the IBRC is to put analytical tools, data, and practical research in the hands of individuals so that they can work with and transcend the challenges of today's rapidly changing world. We've got three wonderful panelists today. I'm going to call them up, I think, in the order that they will speak. First is Kyle Anderson, who will be giving us the U.S. and maybe somewhat international forecast. Kyle is a clinical assistant professor of business economics at the Kelley School in our Indianapolis campus at IUPUI. He also chairs the evening MBA program at IUPUI. He is a native Hoosier, and he is a native Kelley. He's got an MBA and PhD from the Kelley School of Business here in Bloomington. His research focuses on pricing, auctions, and online markets. And in addition to being a wonderful academic, he has 7 years experience in the healthcare industry and heavy trucking industry. As I said, he's a native of Indianapolis, but I believe you currently live in Bloomington, right? So welcome Kyle to the stage. Our second panelist today is Jill Long-Thompson, who will be providing the Indiana and Bloomington Metro forecast. As many of you know, Jill Long-Thompson has had a remarkable career in government and politics. She was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1989 and served 3 terms as a congresswoman from the state of Indiana. Subsequently, President Bill Clinton nominated her to serve as Undersecretary of Agriculture for Rural Development. She then went on to become the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate in 1986 and for governor of the state of Indiana in 2008, being the first woman nominated from a major party for either of those positions. After that service, Long-Thompson served as a board chair and chief executive officer of the Farm Credit Administration from 2009 to 2015, having been nominated and appointed by President Barack Obama. She is a native Hoosier as well. She is a native Kelley as well. So she also received her MBA and PhD from the Kelley School of Business. And we've been very fortunate to have her back at IU for the last few years as a visiting clinical associate professor and dean's fellow at the Kelley School. She teaches not only at the Kelley School of Business, but also at the O'Neill School, which for those of you who may not know, that's the SPIA. You may remember that name more. When she's not in Bloomington, Professor Long-Thompson lives with her husband, Don Thompson, in Marshall County on a farm. So please welcome Jill Long-Thompson. Our third panelist is Charles or as we call him Chuck, Trzynka, who will do the financial markets forecast. Chuck Trzynka joined the faculty at the Kelley School of Business in 2000 as the James and Virginia Kozad Chair of Finance. He's a native of Massachusetts, but he did get educated in Indiana, although it's a school up north. He has an MBA and PhD in finance from Purdue University. His various positions have included serving on the faculties at SUNY Buffalo and New York University, as well as now at IU. He was director of the U.S. Commerce Department's MBA program in China, and he was a senior economist with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Professor Trzynka's research interests are focused on the financial markets, specifically asset pricing and the measurement of risk, as well as the management of investment institutions. His research has been published in quite a few top journals in finance and has been honored with a number of research awards. In addition, his research has been very important in terms of practical implications, particularly his research dealing with mutual funds and institutional money management, which has been widely published in the national press, such as Business Week and New York Times. He also has testified on mutual fund regulations in front of the House Commerce Committee. So please join me in welcoming Chuck Trzynka. So the panelists are going to make some short remarks, I think maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, and then we will have plenty of opportunity for questions from you to get their insights on that. So I think we will start with Professor Henderson.
So thanks for coming out today, and I always love this time of year. Kind of optimism springs eternal. All of our conversations beforehand were, I had people asking me if we're going to get a great economic outlook of 4% growth. Chuck tells me that the IU football team is going to make the Rose Bowl. And of course, optimism is always eternal here as basketball.
Now you know how to trust my forecast.
As basketball season is upon us. Unfortunately, our outlook may not be as optimistic as maybe some of those sporting scenarios. A year ago, we forecast that the economy would grow and would improve in 2019 relative to 2018. Unfortunately, we turned out to be too optimistic in that forecast. Right now, the economy is poised to grow about 2% in 2019. I would describe it as being okay, but it's not great, and it's certainly not as good as it was a year ago. Since 2009, we've kind of been stuck in a pattern where growth has averaged about 2.3%. When I say growth, I'm talking in terms of GDP, in terms of overall output. And this really 2% is a pretty weak number for the expansion that we've had. And the current economy is struggling to meet even that. So one of the reasons that maybe we missed our target a little bit is that we were and we remain concerned that international trade frictions and the global economy are posing a significant downside risk to the U.S. market. So, and it looks like that is definitely bearing out. If we want to break down GDP, we've really got kind of a strange story right now. Consumption, which makes up a large part, and this is household consumption, makes up a large part of our economy, is actually quite strong, over 3% right now. Government spending is quite strong, 3.4% on the federal level. But the other components of GDP are much weaker, and specifically business investment, which tends to be one of the more volatile areas of GDP, is very weak right now. Housing investment is also down. Housing investment has been negative 8 of the last 10 quarters. We saw a little spike in the last reading, but the overall trend is fairly negative. And these weak investment numbers are really pretty troubling given that we have very low interest rates, which should seem to spur investment. Looking at some of the specific segments, manufacturing is down over the last 12 months. There's a little bit of noise around it, but it seems like we are in a contracting manufacturing environment right now. We're seeing that, and that manufacturing makes up about 12% of the economy, a little more in terms of output, a little bit less in terms of number of jobs and number of workers, but that is a significant segment to be dragging down on the economy. And part of that is due to the lack of trade. The other component of GDP are exports or net exports, and that's also a negative in our economy. So right now we're seeing a bit of weakness that doesn't look like that looks like it might be around for a little while. There are some bright spots in the economy, and it's most notably in the labor market. So we're all aware that unemployment is quite low, about 3.5% right now. If it drops down another tick down to 3.4, 3.3, that would be the lowest unemployment level since the post-war era of the 1950s. So we're maybe not at historically low levels, but certainly in terms of recent history, at extremely low levels of unemployment. Wages are picking up. Wage gains are about 2.5%. And these two are obviously very important for our economy for a couple of reasons. We all want jobs, or those of us who are looking for jobs would like to have them, and we'd all like to have wage gains, but also the household sector is really driving our economic growth right now. If we get in a situation where jobs aren't increasing or wages aren't increasing, then that would tend to pull back, and that would be a big driver of our economy that could potentially disappear. So looking to 2020, we expect output growth to continue about 2% or maybe even a little bit less than that level. Employment trends will continue. We'll have moderate employment growth. One of the challenging things from an economic point of view right now is that the federal government is hiring lots of folks to conduct a 2020 census. So the the employment numbers will look better for a little while, and then they'll look really bad once the census gets done and that goes back down. So it's always a little bit of a challenge to see what's going on in hiring with that. But the labor market will remain tight. It's going to continue to be a challenge for businesses to hire folks, and that's one of the inhibitors of growth in our economy. Consumer spending will continue to advance, probably at a rate lower than it has been this year. Again, it's hard for households to keep spending at a greater rate than their income is going up. I know that we are a nation of debtors, but that can only last for so long. It does help that interest rates remain low. Government spending will continue to increase and be a driver of some growth, but there is a budget cycle coming up, and we can talk more about the fiscal situation in a second. Having said that, our forecast has more risks to the downside than it does to the upside. It's more likely we'd be too optimistic as we were last year than that we were just a little bit too pessimistic. And there are a couple reasons for that. The trade war and the trade frictions we have could easily get worse before they get better. There are policies in place to significantly increase tariffs. That would be a drain on the economy. More broadly, the international state of affairs creates a lot of challenges. China has structural issues that it's trying to deal with as growth slows there. Even in spite of or in addition to any tariff situations, global international growth seems to be a little bit weaker right now. Europe and Great Britain are dealing with the Brexit, which again poses risks to some of our trading partners. The fiscal debt and the deficit are quite large and growing right now. Those are unlikely. We don't foresee that posing a risk in 2020, but at some point those issues will certainly need to be dealt with. So essentially we've got this strange situation where if you want to be optimistic and you're looking at 2020, you can say, well, consumers continue to spend, eventually business investment will pick back up and maybe things will get better. The flip side of that is that maybe it'll be consumers that pull back while business investment remains low and we dip into even slower growth or possibly a recession. A lot of people fixate on whether we could potentially have a recession in 2020. I'm an economist, so of course I'm going to say we could potentially have one, right? There's no doubt it's within the range of possibilities, but we don't see it in our forecasting model. What's much more likely is a continuous slowing of growth. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to talk about the financial markets.
Lorraine wanted, okay.
Or
I'm happy to go.
Lorraine, did you want to introduce Chuck again? Or?
No, I don't need to.
Okay.
I don't know if Jill or Chuck was going to go next.
Okay.
It's up to you.
I don't care. I can go out anytime, any place.
Why don't I go? Because
Let's hear Indiana, and,
I think
and then we'll talk about finance.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because it's a logical flow from U.S. to world U.S. to Indiana and then to Bloomington. And I would like to begin, however, by telling you it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I have always enjoyed the opportunity to spend time with Rotarians, and I was particularly struck by the reflection today and how consistent it is with what I came away from Indiana University believing, and it was a building of what I had learned growing up on a farm in northern Indiana. And that is the importance of capitalism, where people have a right to private ownership, and also the importance of a democratic process where we have equal opportunity to participate. That combination, I think, is as strong as it gets, and the kinds of work that Rotarians do in the United States and around the world in advancing those values, I think it continues to make a huge difference in not just individual lives, but communities and entire nations. It is an honor to be here. I have to, in the interest of full disclosure, admit to you that I did not prepare the Indiana Outlook. It was prepared by a colleague, Dr. Ryan Brewer, professor of finance and a research assistant who also worked on this, Sun Yoon. And I feel very privileged to report his work, but I want to make it clear if anything is wrong and the forecast is incorrect, it's not my fault. The
True politician.
As Kyle mentioned, the leading indicators are to some degree mixed, and there is certainly some turbulence in the news cycles, which makes it a little bit challenging to predict, certainly longer term, but even over the next year. But Dr. Brewer is projecting that the Indiana economy will grow at a rate of about 1.25% in 2020, and that would be good news, certainly. Some of the challenges that we face in Indiana are similar to challenges faced nationally. The tax cuts have not led to the projected business investments because companies tend to be buying back stock rather than making capital purchases. We also have trade uncertainties which impact our potential to grow. And there has been a contraction in manufacturing, which is important to the Indiana economy. In fact, the last 3 reports in a row have showed a contraction. And coming from northern Indiana, I certainly can relate to this potential issue. We're expecting a drop of about 2% in car and light truck sales in 2020, and Indiana depends on the auto industry more than many states, and on manufacturing more so. But as Kyle pointed out, consumer spending has strengthened, and that's partly as a result of wage increases. In Indiana, there is some concern that consumer spending, however, could stall a little bit because we have a tight labor market and that keeps wages up. And so we don't have a lot of potential for adding to that, so that could be an issue. We expect the rate of growth of Indiana's gross state product to be less in 2020 than it was in 2019. And as labor shortages continue, the expansion will seek productivity gains through capital investments, and the result will likely be job growth that continues to lag behind the rest of the country, which it has been. On the positive side, we do have a high labor force participation rate, higher than neighboring states, but we still haven't completely covered in that area since the Great Recession. And wages in Indiana do lag behind the rest of the country. Manufacturing is very important to Indiana's economy. In fact, 17.24% of employment and almost 28% of our GSP comes from manufacturing, and that, as you know, manufacturing is very impacted by trade disagreements and uncertainties. I always talk a little bit about agriculture because it is important to the state and it's my background. The gross output from farming is $4.4 billion, that is as of 2017. It only comprises about 2.4% of the state's economy, but it is related to other purchases, heavy equipment, and so forth. We are the 8th largest ag exporter in the United States, and the trade war is hurting demand, and that impacts rural communities and the rural economy. Indiana is basically at full employment. If the national economy continues to grow, obviously the state economy is likely to do the same. The challenge is that 2020 could have an expansion or growth in some of the negative issues that we're dealing with in the economy today. Indiana also lags in educational attainment and in business investment, and that makes us vulnerable as a state. As I move on to the Bloomington economy, however, educational attainment here is strong, as you know, for a variety of reasons. The Bloomington economy, however, does operate not as an island in and of itself, but as part of the larger state economy and the larger national economy. I always think that when you're looking at what might happen and trying to project what will happen, it's good to look at trends in addition to the larger economy. And the trends here have been very good since the Great Recession. The gross domestic product was almost $6.4 billion for the Bloomington metropolitan area in 2017, and that's the most recent year that I have data available. And that reflects a growth of approximately 2% since 2009. When the Great Recession ended in June of 2009, the seasonally adjusted U.S. unemployment rate was 9.5%, and in Indiana, the unemployment rate was 10.6%. For Bloomington, it was 7.5%. That was not seasonally adjusted because I wasn't able to find a seasonally adjusted number. But the recovery clearly took time. That was a significant recession, obviously. But finally, in 2016, the unemployment rate in Bloomington dropped below 4% and has hovered between 2.9 and 4.6% since. In August of this year, it was 3.6%. That's very positive, and I think that provides a positive outlook as well. Employment growth has also grown in the Bloomington MSA. In June 2009, 75,000, a little over, people were employed, but for the estimate for 2019 is almost 80,000. Personal income has been rising in real dollars. Total personal income generated in 2010, $5.9 billion. The total for 2019 is currently estimated to be about 42% higher at 8.4. And between 2010 and 2017, the last year for which data are available, real per capita income grew 19%. The Bloomington area, and what I'm going to say shouldn't surprise you, the Bloomington area has characteristics that make it very appealing. I live 3.5 hours away and choose to work here because this is such an appealing location. And it's not just the businesses that are here, it's also the people. The population has grown here from 190,800 in 2009 to a forecasted population of 202,500 for 2019. That is a positive. So I think overall, the outlook for Bloomington for the next year is positive. We can expect growth. I'm not comfortable enough to give you a specific growth rate projection, but I think we can expect growth unless something unforeseen occurs in the larger U.S. economy or world economy and U.S. economy. It is reasonable, I think, to be cautiously optimistic, and I also think if certain things are dealt with on the national level, including the deficit spending, and that's a real challenge. If we get some more stability in our trade relationships, that a place like Bloomington, Indiana has every reason to believe positive growth and opportunity in the longer term as well. There are assets here, including the population, that make it a very appealing place to settle and to grow business. And with that, I will turn it over to.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always an honor. It's great to be back in Alumni Hall. You've just heard a forecast about Indiana economy in Bloomington. The market's here. Kyle talked about labor market, the national economy. I just have one to forecast. That's the stock market. Yeah, easy on the list. I always say that, or usually say, that keep in mind my salary doesn't depend on my forecast, but maybe I should ask Lorraine about that one, or my boss. If it does, maybe I got a different one. So last year at this time, I forecast a below average return. Yesterday, the market hit record levels. The returns were 12% from November 4th last year to November 4th this year. So I was wrong. The average return is about 7%. But from November 4th last year to October 9th, which is 233 trading days, I was right. The market was below 7%. It was about 6.6. But then in the 18 days from October 10th till now, the market added $1.5 trillion. Don't tell Bernie and Elizabeth about that one. The $1.5 trillion to the wealth of America. We had 5.4% rate of return. That's what made me wrong the past 18 days. Reviewing the 18 days may tell us something about what happens in the future. So the first thing that happened in the past 18 days was a Federal Reserve cut last Wednesday. It shifted many interest rates down, not the mortgage rate though. The mortgage rates stayed up. Cutting the federal rates often, but not always, is a path to lower rates. And this is the federal funds rate, the rate between banks. It seems the market responded to that cut positively. Secondly, there was another interest rate story, which is from May till October, the long-term rate was lower than the short-term rate. Okay? And then October 15th, it reversed. So somebody was projecting, and usually when the long-term rate is lower, it means it's commonly, not always, commonly a forecast of a recession in the future. That changed, and maybe the stock market responded. The third thing that happened was the perpetual trade war seems to be petering out. The trade deficit with China actually fell 3% in September, and the two sides appear to be closing on the deal. However, economic growth, as Kyle has said, is still anemic. The U.S. trade deficit is 13% higher than it was when Trump took office. The great economic question of the Trump administration is how much faster the economy would be growing without the damage of the trade protection. I'm going to hit it a little hard here. The economy still continued to grow as a result of consumer spending, and Kyle talked about that. The second quarter in a row, the consumers failed to offset business investing. But the last 2 quarters of business investment have been negative. And so in 2017, 2018, business investment was pretty strong, responding to, in my view, tax cuts and deregulation, and maybe animal spirits. But since then, since the somewhere late 2018, business investment has been falling. In early part of the Trump administration, especially in 2018, GDP was going up to 3%, but we are back down to an anemic 2%. Now, the White House blames the Federal Reserve in Europe for this slump, but neither explanation holds up. Okay, Europe hasn't grown fast for decades, and the 2017 growth bump was helped by the U.S. It didn't go the opposite direction. Businesses are not starving for cash, and especially even before the federal cut rate this summer. So we are now at the point where we have inflation of about 1.7%, and with a federal funds rate between 1.5 and 1.75, that means negative real rates. This is not a tight money policy. Last week, the Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell said that for the first time in 7 quarters, housing was positive in the 3rd quarter. But housing is a form of consumption. It doesn't drive productivity gains. It doesn't increase wages that other investment does, business investment does. So the larger point is that monetary policy can't make up for bad macroeconomic decisions. So with this as a background, the title of my talk, I should have mentioned it before, was "When Will PE Ratios Be Great Again?" And what I mean by that is, when will fundamentals take over from decisions in Washington? What do I mean by fundamentals? Stock prices are determined by the future stream of cash flows, driven by earnings, and then the valuation of earnings. So this is typically captured in the PE ratio, and I kind of organized some of the facts around that. Let's look at some of the fundamentals. The positive fundamentals are, analysts are forecasting that earnings will be about 10% higher in 2020. So there's about 75% of all companies have now reported for 3rd quarter 2019. And the forecasts are generally positive for 2020 on earnings. Energy is predicted to grow 25%. The worst sector is financials, 4.8%. Revenue is also expected to grow, not by nearly as much, 5.3%. The best sectors are communication services, and the worst sector is financial, is expected to rise 1.9%. Year-over-year growth in revenue is positive. But you'll see in a minute about earnings. When companies have reported earnings above mean estimates, 76% of them have done it. The average is about 60, so more companies have beaten what analysts thought. There have been a bunch of IPOs this year, which is a good sign. 140, it's down about 4% from last year, but that's still nowhere near what it was in 2016, 2017. We've had some big ones, Uber and Slack, and of course we had my favorite disaster, which is WeWork. The negatives, other than WeWork, let's talk about negatives in terms of earnings and negative valuation. Year-over-year earnings decline. From quarter 3 2018 to quarter 3 2019, there's the S&P 500 a negative 2.7. S&P companies with more international exposure have had largest declines. For those with over 50% of revenue internationally, the earnings decline is almost 8%. Now, for the S&P as a whole, 38% come from international, non-US sources. But information, tech, and materials, consumer staples are all above half. Energy is 41%. These are all the sectors showing negative, the biggest negative hit for earnings. Companies are guiding earnings downward for quarter 4, so we are going to see for the first time in years negative earnings growth from 2018 to 2019. So that the earnings story is not great. I mean, certainly for 2020, to summarize, yes, they're positive, but 2018 to 2019 has been, it looks like it's going to be negative. What about valuation? Well, valuation ratios are high. As of yesterday, the 12-month, so for what we call forward PE price today, earnings, average earnings over the next year, has been about 17. This is higher than average. The current PE ratio is 22 if you follow current PE ratios. The forward ratio is above the 5-year average and above the 10-year average. If you follow Shiller's CAPE ratio, that's at 29, which is lower than it was last year, which was high last year, but it's still as high as it's been. It's 35 was about what it was just before the dot-com bubble. In 2020, we expect most companies to continue to produce positive earnings over the coming year, which should help the PE ratio, but there's little room for valuation increase. The other thing that drove the market in 2019 was stock repurchases, which is a good short-term signal because basically you're returning cash. It's sort of a bad long-term signal or medium-term signal because it means that now you're paying money to shareholders and not reinvesting in the firm. So I'm taking that as a decline. I'm sorry, the stock repurchases as a negative. Volatility levels have been high. The VIX index, if you follow VIX index, that's been high. Both Jill and Ken mentioned, Kyle mentioned the budget deficits. We're close to $1 trillion, $960 billion. That's 4.5% of GDP, which has increased the federal debt held by the public, which is now 78% of GDP, projected to be 88% in 5 years. This is the largest expansion since World War II. And if interest rates rise to their average levels, we're going to get a payment on the federal interest that'll be larger than the defense budget. For every 1% of interest on the federal debt, it's $140 billion worth of federal spending. But public debt isn't increasing interest rates. And I think I've used this analogy before. It's like a 5'6", 400-pound guy who's adding 10, 20 pounds a year, and his cholesterol's good, and his blood pressure's good, and his sugar's good, and his pulse is low, and doesn't seem to be a problem just yet. We're certainly not, it certainly hasn't, interest rates are, if anything, flat. They fell from Wednesday of last week to today. We're projecting a slight increase. And part of the reason why our interest rates aren't going up, maybe one of the big reasons is there's international demand for our debt. Germany is now issuing debt at a stated negative rate. The U.S. obviously still faces a huge funding deficit in Social Security and social welfare programs. International risk, the IMF says the pace of global economy remains weak. And frankly, the rising trade and geopolitical tensions are putting questions about the future of geopolitical cooperation. China is having its own problems, partly because of us, partly because of internal stuff. So after going through all this, I asked my students what they thought. The seniors were a little more pessimistic than the juniors, about 60%. So I gave them the 7% or above, let's call that above average, 7% average, 0 to 7, let's call that below average, and then negative. There were a couple of bears, real negative, but most of the class were in the 0 to 7% range. And then there were about 40%, 30% were average. Again, the seniors were a little more optimistic. The bull case is that trade will turn around, and that will because the White House wants to be reelected, so trade's going to turn around and the market's going to go up. I think I'm with the group in below average, but above 0. I think the positives may just outweigh the negatives. The economy is anemic. We think GDP growth will be 2%. Inflation's about 1.7. Valuations on the high side, but the unemployment's low, and we are having some positive earnings forecasts. So I'm guessing between 0 and 7, which is exactly the forecast I gave last year. That was right for 233 days, and then wrong for 18. If the administration policies stabilize, PE ratios will be great again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle, Jill, and Chuck, for those insights. Now we have the audience participation part. So if you have questions, please write them on the cards that are at your table. And if you raise your hand, I think someone will come around and collect those from you and bring those up to the panelist. All right, I will start with these, and the order pretty much that I received them. So the first question is, do you see negative interest rates as a possibility in the U.S.? And if so, what are the implications for the U.S. and world economy?
I'll take that. I don't. I think that Germany gets away with it because of the exchange rate with euro. I think what people are doing is betting on the euro. I don't think people are going to bet on the dollar. So basically, what negative interest rates, we have negative real interest rates, right? And interest rates on U.S. treasuries are lower than inflation. So that's a negative real rate. But in terms of negative stated rate, I don't think so. In terms of what's the effect of the economy, well, I mean, government can, so the first part of it is government can increase expenditure and add to GDP. And then we can build all kinds of infrastructure. I mean, the Swiss have negative interest rates and they're building tunnels through every mountain in the Alps. I don't think the U.S. will need to go there, though. I think that I don't think they can. We will need to go. We will be able to go to something at that level.
Okay. Here's a follow-on, and you may have already addressed this, but I will see if you have anything else you want to say. Do you think the Fed is done cutting rates? What is your projection for rates in 2020, say 10-year treasuries?
I'm sorry. What's that?
Do you think the Fed is done cutting rates?
We've got one more cut in forecast in the econometric model. I suspect so. But I'm not, I wouldn't bet on no cuts. I think we've got one cut forecast. I mean, it's not that businesses are hurting for cash. I mean, cash positions are building up. It's not this huge demand for loans that are out there. It's not like you need more liquidity in this economy. So the Fed is, I mean, Jay Powell is trying to make up for the supply chain problems and the trade problems. And so but I do think I think we've got one more cut for 25 basis points sometime mid-year in the model. But the answer is not. I would be surprised if there was more than one more.
The next question is, how impactful is the low level of new home starts in Monroe County on the continued growth of local employers and the ability to attract new business investment?
I missed the first part of that question.
How impactful is the low level of new home starts in Monroe County on the continued growth of local employers and the ability to attract new business investment?
That is a good question, and I haven't looked at those numbers, so I don't feel comfortable doing even a quick analysis, other than to say in general it could have an impact.
I think one of the things we're seeing in a lot of markets is that in a lot of cases overly restrictive zoning is really preventing a supply of housing that would be beneficial, and there's affordable housing problems in the United States, but a lot of times those are exacerbated by policymakers that are kind of very restrictive in their zoning, and people would benefit, and especially in a fairly tight market like Bloomington, I think we would benefit from greater supply of housing.
The next question also relates to Indiana. How much of a drag on the Indiana economy is the opioid crisis? Is the situation improving?
As somebody who served as Undersecretary for Rural Development and worked with rural communities all across the country, it has to be a drag because it has an impact on the labor force. It sucks money out of the economy for treatment and programs. It reduces productivity. And so I can't give you a figure. I'm sure there has been some research on that. I don't have that figure at my fingertips, but it clearly does have an impact. And as someone who lives in a rural community where we struggle just to attract business, any time you have something that detracts from the positive assets in a community like opioid use, it's going to pull down potential for economic growth and development.
Let me add to that. I just reviewed a paper where somebody looked at municipal bond interest rates in counties around the country that had opioid centers. It was pretty interesting to see the effect on those interest rates. Obviously, munis around the country, and I can show you to you. Had a map of all 2,000 counties or something in the country, whatever, and it was like 20, 30 basis points, and for some of these munis, it was a lot more. I mean, this was opening opioid centers in counties that was borrowing, including counties that borrowed regularly. So it is a pretty big drag. It's also a drag on labor force participation too. But that's that's the thing that's feeding the muni interest rates.
Yeah, one of our colleagues has looked into this. Ryan Brewer's looked into it. And he estimated, and this was about a year ago, that it was taking about 0.5% off of state GDP here in Indiana. And again, when we're forecasting, 1 and 1.5% growth, take 0.5% off that. That's significant. And I mean, that was a year ago based on the numbers. I know we've taken some steps forward, but I'm sure that problem is probably not shrinking. We may be stemming how quickly it's growing, but it's still a significant issue.
The next question is, if businesses are afraid of investment, should consumers be worried about their spending habits?
Yes. Yes, they should, because I mean, I think that we're not seeing capital investment. Business investment is important because, as Chuck talked about a little bit, it drives productivity growth, and productivity growth over the long run helps lead to wage gains. And so there's a longer term issue there of, if we're not making those investments, productivity is not going to increase, wages are not going to go up. But if businesses are afraid to make capital investments, what's the next step? If they don't see that they want to increase output, maybe they start deciding to pull back from hiring, and it's too hard to hire, and so we'll just pull back altogether. So I think that if you don't have business investment, one of the ways that feeds out is consumer spending is going to go down because of, wages are not going to increase, and we're not going to have the same rate of job growth.
This is a question specifically for Chuck. Could you comment on the movement towards passive indexed investing in recent times and the impact on the markets?
This is pretty controversial. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with this issue, the amount of money in passive management, where it's attempting only to match the market, has grown dramatically over the past 5 years, maybe 10. Partly through a type of a mutual fund called an ETF, partly through index funds. And it's had a pretty large effect for investors. There's a battle going on. You'll read a lot in the press, financial press, or the stuff I read anyway, that says that it's a bad thing. So passive investors are keeping active investors out of the market. They're not pricing things. And then you see some evidence that it's a good thing, because what's happening is that the active managers who are surviving are the ones who are doing are the ones who are good and the ones adding value. So right now, the mutual funds are about 65% passive, 35-40% active. By the way, I should mention my brother's an active manager in a big mutual fund. So of course I think he's adding a huge amount of value. My side I come down with, I'm not worried about it. But I can certainly quote all the evidence where people argue it increases volatility, and it increases, it gives people, people are betting on using ETFs and that sort of thing. But I can have a longer conversation like this on this offline. So I don't see it as that big a problem.
The next question is, assuming we have more and better data and tools to measure economic activity than at any time in history, how accurate are the forecasts in comparison to the past? Does it change long-held views upon which you make predictions in, say, interest rates and inflations?
I have an opinion on this. The amount of data is growing and the accuracy is falling. Okay, and never in the past have we had nearly as much data and nearly ability to analyze it, and the accuracy is falling. Part of the reason is we don't really have data. What we have are big collections of anecdotes. There's all these unbiases. These data are collected for other purposes. I work out with this neuroscientist who jokes about all the time about you don't have data, you just have anecdotes. So we are getting. We have the illusion that we can forecast. In my view, it's a harder and harder time forecasting, unless the data is collected specifically for the thing that you might forecast, and that's not common. I often want to relabel the word data analytics to be anecdote analytics, but nobody's asking me about that one.
And a lot of the headline numbers that you see, you think of, the unemployment rate is still a household survey. And so you can think about the challenges, and they're not particularly precise numbers. And we see that with the GDP numbers are frequently revised. But I mean, you can imagine you're trying to basically measure all of the economic activity in the United States in a given quarter and do so in a timely manner. It's a significant challenge that right now I don't think that big data or data analytics is really helping us do it. Maybe someday in the future everything will be tracked that way.
Here's a local question and an IU question. Will rising student loan debt start to impact enrollment numbers in Bloomington and nationwide? How would declining enrollment numbers impact Bloomington and the U.S.?
I can make a stab at that. Certainly, declining enrollment numbers would have an impact on the Bloomington economy because, and that could be offset by something else that would happen. And we do know that there is nationwide going to be a drop-off in the mid-2020s. I think, is it 2026, I believe, Laureen? Is that the year that we're expecting the national?
Yes, roughly.
2026. And so that would clearly have an impact. But again, for good long-term planning, not just a university but a community needs to always be looking for counter strategy to offset negative expectations based on forecasts. And I think that and I think I'm a bit objective when I look at the Bloomington area and see what kind of potential exists here. It's not just the student enrollment, but it's everything that comes with a major university, in addition to some of the industries that have headquartered here, and the potential for research and new technologies in science and other areas that I think can offset any loss in enrollment. It also occurs to me that big universities like Indiana University have potential for growth even when there is a decline in college-age students nationwide or globally. Even I think you can. I think that the challenges are in terms of enrollment are larger for smaller regional colleges and universities that are not nationally or internationally known. So I think that there's still even with a smaller number of students, I think there's so much potential as long as the planning is done and you have offsetting, you identify how to offset some of those changes. I didn't say that very clearly, but I think you know what I meant.
Yeah.
All right, the next question is, what are the biggest competitive advantages for Bloomington for the coming years? What are the biggest challenges to look out for?
Well, I mean, I think that it kind of builds on the previous question of the, higher education market, I think is going to undergo significant changes over the next decade, and whether that's, student loan, pricing, less funding from state governments, and competition from online education and other alternative models to the traditional. That's certainly a huge potential risk for IU. I think that they are taking steps to address those and prepare for that. So that's probably the greatest risk to the Bloomington area is being, having at least a significant dependence. Obviously, there's a lot of business here outside of the university, but it's disproportionate relative to other places in the state.
Okay. Another question is, how are two-wage families figured into the equations?
What equation?
I don't.
Which one?
Well, I mean, one of the things that it's kind of shown up is think of it in terms of the labor force participation rate. So we've had over the last 50 years basically a demographic shift in the U.S. where there are more households with two wage workers. Women have joined the workforce more significantly. That peaked in about 2000. And since then, and especially since 2008, the labor force participation rate declined significantly. It has now kind of flattened out over the last 4 or 5 years, and it could potentially go lower due to the retiring generation, the baby boom generation. So in terms of economic growth, one of the reasons we saw a big benefit for a long time was just an increase in the number of workers, and that trend has flattened out and could potentially reverse going forward. Other
That's good.
thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, a real damper on economic growth, as Cal mentioned, is a lack of workers. I mean, companies all around the country are looking at they just can't find people to expand. In that way, our immigration policies work against us. And there's only, the labor force participation has been down, although it's grown over the past year. I think it's about 64%. But there's not much upside in that.
I mean, I think this is something where policymakers could, really help out in terms of a balance between having, encouraging people to, whether it's, parental leave, those kinds of issues that can help people stay in the workforce over the longer term and still balance family work. You look at things like universal pre-K, paid leave policies. I think those things, when they're done well, should be designed to encourage a strong labor force and yet balance out childcare needs and social goods that we all want going forward that are important.
So we have time for one more question, and I apologize to those we didn't get to. I think some of the ones we didn't get to were more on the upcoming election, and I would encourage you to talk to these people privately. I'm sure they have things to say.
We have opinions.
Absolutely no opinion.
But the question is, does anyone on the panel have knowledge of or firsthand accounts from Indiana business community on the impacts of the trade war and what type of businesses have been hurt or would have been hurt and helped?
Agriculture's been hurt.
Exports, I mean, Indiana has high-tech exports. They've been hurt. The biggest one, I think, is agriculture, though. Probably soybean.
Agriculture, and then we're seeing weakness in manufacturing, and I'd say that's directly related, both from an export point of view, but also a supply chain issue. Right. When you have tariffs on things like steel, that raises steel prices, and it hurts Indiana manufacturers beyond just those who are exporting. It really creates some perverse incentives for businesses to move production overseas rather than do it here in the United States. So,
Indiana University has been hurt by the immigration policies, which are sort of related to trade policies, in students coming from overseas.
All right, let's thank the panel, and I'll turn it over to Lauren Snyder.
It's a great slide. Kim did a fantastic. I had some comments on what she did.
As we are sticklers for time in Rotary meetings, I want to get you guys out of here right on at 1 p.m. here. So many thanks to all of you for attending this afternoon, to the Bloomington Rotary clubs that support our communities, the Greater Bloomington Chamber, and our moderator and panelists for being here this afternoon. Thank you once again. As I concluded our regular Rotary celebrations of service as president, I want to leave you with a thought for the week, and ultimately also our four-way Rotary test that you'll see on the yellow sheet on your tables. But a thought for the week, which is applicable in whatever aspect of life you're going back. It's an oldie but a goodie for me. Is use every day as an opportunity to get better, because tomorrow that opportunity will be gone. Whether that's financial, whether that's personal or professional. Use every day as an opportunity to get better, because tomorrow that opportunity will be gone. So please rise and join us with the Rotary four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun? Thank you. Have a great afternoon.